In the war-torn ruins of Eastern Europe's Sector 19, a quiet logistics clerk was about to face the most impossible shot in military history. What started as a routine high-risk operation took a shocking turn when an elite sniper team came face-to-face with their greatest challenge yet. A target with only 5 seconds of exposure and environmental conditions that defied every rule of long-range marksmanship. Elena Ward wasn't your typical support staff member. For years, she had spent her life operating in the shadows of classified programs, known for her unnerving stillness and the mysterious rifle case she carried like a sacred relic. When she encountered Sergeant Rennick's skeptical team during their mission briefing, they had no idea they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that transcended human limitations. Elena's calm assertion that she would make the shot would lead to a demonstration that shattered everything they thought they knew about the laws of physics. What began as professional doubt would become absolute awe. Forward operating Base Titan would never be the same after the morning a ghost made the impossible inevitable with nothing more than a whisper in the darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped operations room buried deep within forward operating Base Titan. Sergeant Alex Rennick studied the faces of his team as they gathered around the metal briefing table, their expressions grim in the amber glow. Outside, the distant rumble of armored vehicles and the sharp crack of small arms fire reminded everyone that this corner of Eastern Europe remained a powder keg ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Lieutenant Paul Harker cleared his throat and activated the wall-mounted display. Satellite imagery flickered to life, showing an aerial view of a war-scarred city district. Red circles marked key positions, while blue arrows traced potential approach routes through the maze of bombed-out buildings and debris-filled streets. "Gentlemen," Harker began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who lived by data and doctrine. "This is Sector 19, target designation Crimson Wolf." A new image appeared, a grainy photograph of a bearded man in his 50s, eyes cold as winter steel. Rennick had seen that face in classified briefings for months. Dmitry Kozlov, warlord and arms dealer, responsible for half of the chaos in this region. "Intel confirms he'll be moving through this corridor." Harker's laser pointer traced a narrow alley between 2 concrete barriers. "Tomorrow at 0830 hours. Window of exposure, 5 seconds maximum before he disappears into the fortified compound." Corporal Mason Drake leaned back in his chair, a crooked grin playing across his weathered features. 5 seconds? Hell, Lieutenant, I could put 3 rounds center mass in that time frame. "Not from our position you couldn't," Rennick interjected, studying the tactical overlay. "Look at this approach angle. 2,000 meters out, crosswinds averaging 20 knots, and we'll be shooting through a thermal layer from those industrial exhaust vents." Private First Class Jonah Briggs, the youngest member of the team, leaned forward with the eager intensity that marked him as either future excellence or a casualty waiting to happen. "Sergeant, what about the building collapse in grid reference 77? Could we use that for a closer position?" Harker shook his head. "Negative. That entire block is under constant surveillance. Any movement in that direction triggers immediate hostile response." Rennick felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 12 years of covert operations had taught him to read between the lines of mission briefings, and this one screamed trap. The target window was impossibly small, the environmental factors were nightmarish, and the escape routes looked like a death sentence disguised as tactical planning. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "I need to ask the obvious question. Why now? Why this particular target when we could wait for a better opportunity?" Before Harker could respond, the secure communications panel crackled to life. The team turned toward the speakers as a woman's voice filled the room, calm, authoritative, and utterly uncompromising. "This is Commander Cross. Be advised you have additional personnel joining this operation." Rennick felt his jaw tighten. Additional personnel meant complications, politics, and usually someone looking over his shoulder while his team tried to stay alive. Ma'am, with respect, this is already a high-risk operation. Adding unknown variables is not your decision, Sergeant. Cross cut him off smoothly. Your new team member is already en route to your position. She'll be handling specialized support for the operation. She? Mason raised an eyebrow and glanced around the table. In their small community of elite marksmen, everyone knew everyone. A female sniper with enough skill to justify insertion into an operation like this would have a reputation that preceded her by years. Commander, Harker spoke up, consulting his tablet, I don't show any additional personnel on the manifest for this mission. Because you don't have clearance for that information, Lieutenant. The asset in question operates under compartmentalized authorization. The words hung in the air like smoke from a muzzle flash. Compartmentalized authorization meant black ops, deep cover, or something even more shadowy. Rennick had worked with plenty of spooks over the years, but they usually came with impressive credentials and insufferable attitudes. The door to the operations room opened with a sharp, metallic click. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of diesel fuel and concrete dust. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the corridor lighting. She was tall and lean, wearing standard desert fatigues without any unit patches, rank insignia, or name tape. A dark baseball cap was pulled low over her eyes, and she carried a single rifle case, slim, black, and obviously custom-made. She didn't speak, didn't salute, didn't acknowledge anyone in the room. Her eyes swept across the briefing table once, taking in the satellite images, wind charts, and tactical overlays with the kind of quick, methodical assessment that spoke of extensive training. Then she moved to an empty chair against the wall and sat down, setting her rifle case across her knees. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Rennick studied her carefully, noting the controlled way she moved, the stillness in her posture that suggested someone who never wasted motion. Early 30s, he estimated, with the kind of weathered composure that came from years in hostile environments. Gentlemen, Cross's voice came through the speakers again. Meet Elena Ward. She'll be providing specialized marksmanship support for tomorrow's operation. Mason snorted softly. Support? Ma'am, no offense, but what kind of support are we talking about here? Spotting? Communications? Because if we're talking about the actual shot, you're talking about the actual shot. Miss Ward will be taking primary responsibility for target elimination. The words hit the room like a flashbang grenade. Rennick felt his protective instincts flare immediately. He'd lost good soldiers to missions that went sideways because some desk jockey decided to fix what wasn't broken. Commander, with respect, my team has trained together for 18 months. We know each other's capabilities, limitations, and operational preferences. Inserting an unknown shooter at the last minute is exactly what you're going to do, Sergeant. Cross's tone carried finality. Miss Ward's qualifications are beyond question. Your job is to provide support and ensure mission success. Rennick glanced at Elena Ward, but she hadn't moved or spoken. She sat with her hands folded over the rifle case, face hidden in shadow beneath the bill of her cap. There was something unsettling about her stillness, like watching a predator that hadn't decided whether you were worth noticing. Harker cleared his throat nervously. Commander, for the after-action report, I'll need to document Miss Ward's credentials and operational background. You'll document what you're authorized to document, nothing more. The communications panel went silent, leaving the 6 people in the room staring at each other across a gulf of uncertainty and suspicion. Mason was the first to break the silence. Well, this is just fantastic. He turned toward Elena. His voice carried the edge of a challenge. So, mystery woman, you want to tell us how you plan to make an impossible shot that none of us could pull off? Elena Ward finally looked up. Her eyes were gray-green, like storm clouds over deep water, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried absolute confidence. I don't plan to make the shot. I'm going to make the shot. Mason had disassembled his Barrett M82A1, laying out each component with the precision of a surgeon. The massive .50 caliber rifle was his preferred tool for long-range work, brutal, effective, and loud enough to announce his presence to every hostile within a 2-mile radius. He cleaned each part with religious devotion, occasionally glancing toward the far corner of the armory where Elena Ward had set up her own workspace. She'd chosen a table near the back wall, away from the main traffic flow and natural observation points. Her rifle case lay open before her, revealing foam cutouts custom-shaped for components that looked nothing like standard military issue. Jonah couldn't help but stare. "Sergeant, what kind of weapon system is that?" Rennick followed his gaze and felt his eyebrows rise slightly. Elena was assembling her rifle with movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Each component was matte black, clearly custom-machined and fitted together with tolerances so tight that no visible gaps existed between parts. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted quietly. "That's not civilian, not standard military. Someone spent serious money on that system." The rifle taking shape under Elena's hands was sleek and purposeful, like a piece of modern sculpture designed for a single, deadly function. The barrel was longer than typical sniper rifles, but somehow appeared more elegant rather than unwieldy. The stock was adjustable in ways that standard weapons weren't, and the scope mounted to it looked like something that belonged in a physics laboratory rather than a battlefield. Harker approached from his own workstation, tablet in hand and expression skeptical. "Miss Ward, I'll need technical specifications for my equipment manifest. Caliber, effective range, ballistic coefficients." "No," Elena said without looking up from her assembly work. "Excuse me? You don't need technical specifications. You need to know that the target will be eliminated when the window opens." She attached what appeared to be a custom bipod system, each leg adjusting independently to compensate for uneven surfaces. "Everything else is irrelevant." Harker's face flushed slightly. "Ma'am, I'm responsible for ensuring all equipment meets operational standards and safety protocols. I can't authorize the use of unregistered weapon systems without proper documentation." Elena finally looked at him, and Rennick noticed something cold flicker behind her eyes. "Lieutenant, do you see any markings on my fatigues? Any unit patches, rank insignia, or identification?" "No, but—" "Then you have no authority over my equipment, my methods, or my mission parameters." She returned to her rifle, making micro-adjustments to components with tools that looked handmade. "Your job is intelligence support. Focus on that." Mason whistled low under his breath. "Well, she's got brass, I'll give her that." He reassembled his Barrett with practiced efficiency, the mechanical sounds of metal sliding into metal echoing through the armory. But brass doesn't make impossible shots possible. Elena was now installing what appeared to be a custom muzzle device, not a standard flash suppressor or compensator, but something altogether more sophisticated. Rennick had seen enough specialized equipment over the years to recognize engineering that went beyond military procurement standards. "What's the effective range on that system?" Jonah asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "Depends on the target," Elena replied, pulling out a small, weather-beaten notebook and flipping through pages covered with handwritten calculations. Environmental factors, atmospheric conditions, thermal layers. She paused at a particular page, running her finger down columns of numbers. 2,000 meters in tomorrow's conditions should be adequate. "Should be?" Mason's voice carried disbelief. "Lady, should be doesn't cut it when you've got 5 seconds in a target that's been dodging bullets for 3 years. Elena closed the notebook and began breaking down her rifle with the same methodical precision she'd used to assemble it. Each component went back into its custom-fitted space in the case, creating a configuration that looked more like a precision instrument than a weapon of war. "Tell me, Corporal Drake," she said without looking at him, "what's your hit probability on a human target at 2,000 meters in a 20-knot crosswind?" Mason straightened, his competitive instincts flaring. 90% or better, assuming proper spotter support and range data. With your Barrett M82A1 using M33 ball ammunition, accounting for the thermal distortion from those industrial exhaust vents we'll be shooting through? The specificity of the question caught Mason off guard. She'd memorized not just the mission parameters, but the environmental factors that would affect ballistic performance. Well, maybe 75%. Too low. 75% means 1 chance in 4 that the target walks away. 1 chance in 4 that everyone who dies because he's still breathing dies for nothing. She stood and shouldered her rifle case, preparing to leave. As she reached the armory exit, Jonah called out, "Ms. Ward, do you need a spotter for tomorrow?" Elena paused at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the corridor lighting beyond. "No," she said simply. "I work alone." After she left, the 4 men sat in contemplative silence for several moments. Finally, Mason shook his head and resumed cleaning his weapon. "I don't care what kind of fancy equipment she's carrying. Physics is physics. Wind is wind. That shot can't be made by a human being." But Rennick found himself thinking about the notebook she'd carried, filled with calculations and corrections written in a quick, confident hand. Most snipers relied on ballistic computers, range cards, and spotter data. Elena Ward seemed to carry her calculations in her head, making adjustments based on factors he wasn't even sure he could identify. "Sergeant," Jonah's voice interrupted his thoughts, "have you ever seen anyone work like that before?" Rennick considered the question carefully. "No, Private, I haven't." The barracks building sat on the edge of the base compound, a prefabricated structure that had seen better decades. Inside, the 4 members of Rennick's team occupied adjacent bunks in a room that smelled of disinfectant, unwashed laundry, and the peculiar staleness that accumulated wherever soldiers lived in close quarters. Mason lounged on his bunk, still wearing his fatigues, boots unlaced but still on his feet. $20 says she cracks under pressure," he announced to the room, tossing a worn paperback onto his chest. "First time she hears incoming fire, she'll be crying for extraction." Harker looked up from his tablet, where he'd been obsessively reviewing mission parameters for the dozenth time. "I'm more concerned about her complete lack of proper documentation. How do we even know she's qualified for this operation?" "Because command says she is," Rennick replied from his own bunk, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. He'd spent the last hour running through every scenario he could imagine for tomorrow's mission, and in each one, Elena Ward remained an unknown variable that could either ensure success or guarantee disaster. Jonah sat cross-legged on his bunk, cleaning his M24 SWS with the careful attention of someone who still treated each piece of equipment like it might save his life. "I don't know, guys. Did you see how she assembled that rifle? I've never seen anyone work with that kind of precision." "Precision with assembly doesn't translate to precision under fire," Mason countered. "I've seen plenty of range queens who could put 10 rounds through the same hole on a calm day, but couldn't hit a barn door when the bullets started flying back." "She's not a range queen," Jonah insisted, running a cleaning rod through his rifle barrel. "The way she moved, the way she handled that equipment, she's done this before." "Done what?" Hasker asked. "We don't even know what this is. Her background is classified, her equipment isn't in any manual I've ever seen, and she refuses to follow standard operational protocols." Rennick sat up on his bunk, feeling the weight of command settling on his shoulders, like it always did before a difficult mission. "Look, I don't like unknowns any more than you do, but we've got our orders, and second-guessing command isn't going to change anything." "Orders or not," Mason said, swinging his legs over the side of his bunk, "I'm not letting some mystery woman compromise mission success. If she hesitates, if she misses, if she does anything that puts the operation at risk, I'm taking the shot myself." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Jonah asked. "She's not using our communications frequency, she's not coordinating her position with our overwatch plan, and she's not following our timing protocols." Mason's jaw tightened. Then maybe it's time someone explained to her how real operators work.
"Stand down, Corporal." Rennick's voice carried quiet authority. "Elena Ward is operating under different rules than we are. Whether we like it or not, that makes her command's problem, not ours." Harker saved his work and closed his tablet. "I've been running probability analyses based on the environmental factors. Even with perfect conditions, the shot probability for a human target at that range and exposure time is less than 30%. Which is why Command brought in their specialist," Rennick pointed out. "Obviously, they think she can do something we can't." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Through the thin walls, they could hear someone moving with the quiet, measured pace of someone who understood operational security, even in supposedly safe areas. "Think that's her?" Jonah whispered. "Probably," Rennick replied. "Question is, where's she going at this hour?" They listened as the footsteps continued past their door and faded into the distance. Mason grinned and stood up, checking his sidearm out of habit. "Well, I'm curious enough to find out." "Mason," Rennick began. "Relax, Sergeant. I'm just going to get some air, maybe see what our mystery woman does when she thinks no one's watching." After Mason left, the remaining 3 men sat in uncomfortable silence. Harker returned to his tablet, but Rennick could see he wasn't actually reading anything. Jonah continued cleaning his rifle with unnecessary thoroughness. "Sergeant," Jonah finally spoke up, "what if she's as good as Command thinks she is?" "Then tomorrow will be a very short operation," Rennick replied. "But what if she's better than that? What if she's operating on a completely different level than anything we've seen before?" Rennick considered the question. In 12 years of special operations, he'd worked with some of the most elite soldiers in the world. SEALs, Delta Force, SAS, Spetsnaz defectors, men and women who could do things that seemed impossible to ordinary mortals. But Elena Ward was different. She carried herself with a kind of absolute confidence that suggested she'd moved beyond the normal limits of human capability. "Then we learned something," he said finally. Meanwhile, Mason found himself following the corridor toward the armory, guided more by instinct than any real plan. The base was quiet at this hour, with only essential personnel manning their posts. Most of the support staff had secured their equipment and retired for the night. The armory door was propped open, a violation of standard security protocols that would normally have triggered an immediate response. Mason approached carefully, drawing his sidearm more from habit than any real threat. Inside, Elena Ward sat alone at her workstation, her rifle case open before her. But instead of working on her weapon, she had that weather-beaten notebook spread out, adding new calculations to pages already dense with numbers and corrections. She was computing wind drift corrections for ammunition he couldn't identify, factoring in atmospheric pressure variations that wouldn't be available until tomorrow morning, and making elevation adjustments for terrain features that weren't marked on any of our maps. As Mason watched from the doorway, Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small electronic device, not military issue, but clearly designed for precision measurement. She consulted it briefly, made another notation in her book, then closed both the device and the notebook. She began preparing to leave, and Mason quickly retreated to avoid being discovered. As he made his way back to the barracks, one thought kept running through his mind. Elena Ward wasn't just confident about tomorrow's mission, she was certain of it, with the kind of mathematical certainty that came from understanding variables the rest of them couldn't even identify. When he reached the barracks, his teammates looked up expectantly. "Well?" Rennick asked. Mason sat down heavily on his bunk, his earlier bravado noticeably absent. "I think," he said slowly, "we might be about to see something that changes everything we thought we knew about this job." Outside, the wind howled across the base compound, carrying the distant sounds of a war that never quite ended. Tomorrow, they would discover whether Elena Ward was everything Command believed her to be, or if they were all walking into a carefully orchestrated disaster. Either way, Rennick thought as he settled back onto his bunk, it was going to be a day none of them would ever forget. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the ruined city like a shroud, broken only by the occasional flicker of emergency lighting from distant buildings. Rennick led his team through the maze of collapsed structures and debris-filled streets, each man moving with the practiced silence of operators who understood that sound traveled differently in urban warfare zones. The air tasted of concrete dust and diesel exhaust, mixed with the acrid smell of fires that had been burning for weeks. Sector 19 stretched before them like a mouthful of broken teeth. Buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks, streets cratered by artillery, and the constant threat of snipers in every shadow. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. Harker's voice crackled through their headsets from his position in the command post. Target convoy is 40 minutes out. Wind speed holding steady at 18 knots, gusting to 22. Rennick checked his watch and signaled for the team to split into their assigned positions. Mason headed toward the elevated position in the damaged church tower, while Jonah took the backup angle from a bombed-out apartment building. Each man carried the weight of knowing that Elena Ward was somewhere in the operational area, but none of them knew exactly where. Beta Team, report position. Rennick spoke into his throat mic as he settled into his own hide behind a collapsed wall that provided excellent concealment and adequate fields of fire. Beta's in position. Mason's voice came back. I've got clear sightlines to the target corridor. Elena, where the hell are you? Silence. Ward, respond, Rennick ordered, scanning the area through his scope. Report your position and status. More silence, followed by a brief transmission that sounded like wind over an open microphone. God damn it, Mason muttered. Sergeant, I can't see her anywhere in the planned positions. Either she's found cover that makes her invisible, or she's completely off the reservation. Rennick felt his jaw tighten. One of the cardinal rules of sniper operations was maintaining communication and coordination. A lone wolf could compromise the entire mission if she attracted attention or interfered with established fields of fire. All stations, this is Alpha. Continue mission as planned. If Elena Ward is not in position when the target appears, we execute standard protocol. Copy that, Mason replied, but his voice carried the edge of someone whose professional pride had been challenged. I'll be ready to take the shot if Mystery Woman decides to no-show. 20 minutes later, Jonah's voice came through the comms system with quiet urgency. Alpha, I've got movement in Sector 7. Someone's in that partially collapsed building, the one Lieutenant Harker marked as structurally unsound. Rennick adjusted his scope and peered through the pre-dawn gloom. The building in question was a 3-story structure that had taken a direct hit from artillery, leaving the upper floors open to the sky and the lower level partially buried under debris. It was exactly the kind of position that doctrine would classify as tactically unsound: poor elevation, obstructed sightlines, and limited escape routes. I see her, he whispered into his mic. Elena, respond immediately. Your position is compromised and dangerous. Elena's voice finally came through their headsets, calm and untroubled. Position is optimal for current environmental conditions. Optimal? Harker's voice cut in from the command post. Elena, your elevation is wrong, your sight lines are obstructed, and you're in a building that could collapse at any moment. Understood, Elena replied, offering nothing more. Mason's frustration boiled over. Look, lady, I don't know what kind of cowboys and Indians operation you think this is, but real sniping requires discipline and coordination. You can't just... His transmission was cut off by Elena's voice, quiet but carrying absolute authority. Radio silence until target acquisition. The order hung in the air like a challenge. Technically, Elena had no command authority over the team, but her tone suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Elena, Rennick tried one more time, your position puts you at a severe disadvantage. The angle is wrong, the range is extended, and you'll be shooting through thermal distortions from those exhaust vents. I know, Elena said simply, and then her radio went silent. From his position, Rennick could just make out a figure moving in the shadows of the collapsed building. Elena had found a hide that was almost invisible from ground level, but it also appeared to be the worst possible position for making a precision shot. She was lower than optimal, farther than necessary, and shooting through environmental obstacles that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistic computers. Sergeant, I think I can see what she's doing. She's not setting up for the primary corridor. She's angled toward that side street, the the one that's not even on our maps. Rennick swung his scope toward the area Jonah indicated. There was indeed a narrow passage between buildings that hadn't appeared in our aerial reconnaissance, probably cleared by recent artillery strikes or building collapses. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Intelligence confirmed the target route through the main corridor." But even as he spoke, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Elena Ward had studied the same maps they had, but she'd also been making calculations based on factors none of them could identify. What if she knew something they didn't?
The minutes crawled by with the agonizing slowness that always preceded contact. Rennick lay prone behind his rifle, watching heat shimmer rise from distant exhaust vents while his mind raced through contingency plans. 35 minutes until the target window opened, and Elena Ward remained a silent, invisible presence in her impossible position. "Alpha, this is Overwatch." Harker's voice was tight with tension. "Target convoy confirmed on approach. 3 vehicles, estimated arrival in 30 minutes. Through his scope, Rennick could see Mason adjusting his position in the church tower, fine-tuning his Barrett M82A1 for the shot that Doctrine said he should be taking. The big rifle was perfectly suited for the mission, powerful enough to penetrate body armor, accurate enough for the range, and loud enough to send a message to anyone watching. Elena's weapon remained a mystery. Rennick had caught glimpses of it during assembly, but he still couldn't identify the caliber, the action type, or even the basic operating principles. It looked more like a precision instrument than a battlefield weapon. "All stations, wind check," he ordered, though he already knew the numbers by heart. The crosswinds were holding steady, but the thermal layer from those industrial exhaust vents would create unpredictable air currents that could deflect a bullet by inches at long range. 18 knots gusting to 22. Thermal distortion is significant in the target area. I'm compensating for approximately 8 inches of drift at 2,000 meters. "Jonah?" "Confirmed. Wind is consistent, but those heat plumes are going to be a problem for anyone shooting through them." Rennick waited for Elena to contribute her own wind assessment, but her radio remained silent. Through his scope, he could just make out her position in the collapsed building, a shadow among shadows that seemed to blend with the rubble around her. "Sergeant," Jonah's voice carried a note of curiosity. "I've been watching Elena's position for the last 10 minutes. She's not using her scope." "What do you mean?" "I mean, she's not behind her rifle. She's sitting back from it, just watching, like she's reading something the rest of us can't see." Rennick shifted his own scope toward Elena's hide and saw what Jonah meant. Instead of being locked onto her rifle in the standard firing position, Elena appeared to be observing the environment with naked eyes, occasionally making subtle adjustments to her rifle's position, but never settling into the sustained aim that marked a sniper preparing for a shot. "Maybe she's tracking the thermal patterns," Mason suggested, his voice skeptical, "though I don't see how that helps with a shot that's going to require split-second timing." 20 minutes to target window," Harker announced. "All stations confirm readiness." "Alpha ready. Beta ready. Charlie ready." Elena's radio remained silent. "Elena, confirm status," Rennick ordered. This time she responded, but her words sent a chill down his spine. "Target will not use primary corridor. Secondary approach confirmed." "What secondary approach?" Harker's voice cracked slightly. "Elena, our intelligence is solid. The target has used the primary corridor for the last 6 months." "Intelligence is wrong," Elena replied, with the calm certainty of someone stating a mathematical fact. "Target will approach from grid 77 Alpha at 0832 hours. Exposure time, 3 seconds. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions as the team tried to process this information. "That's impossible," Harker protested. "Grid 77 Alpha is a dead end. There's no access route." "There is now. Building collapse at 0315 hours this morning cleared the passage." "How could you possibly know that?" Mason demanded. "We've been in position since 0500, and there's been no artillery in that sector." "Structural collapse from previous damage. Thermal expansion from the exhaust vents weakened the remaining supports. The building came down approximately 3 hours ago."
Rennick felt the world shift slightly beneath him. She was describing events none of them had witnessed, in an area none of them had been monitoring, with the kind of certainty that suggested direct observation. But Elena had been with them during the entire approach, and her current position didn't provide line of sight to the area in question. 10 minutes to target window, Harker announced. All stations, maintain position and execute as planned unless directly ordered otherwise. But Rennick found himself watching Elena's position instead of his own target area. She had finally settled behind her rifle, but her posture was relaxed, almost casual. There was no tension in her body, no sign of the controlled stress that marked a sniper preparing for the most difficult shot of their career. She was waiting, but not with anticipation. She was waiting with the patient certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. At exactly 0832 hours, Dmitry Kozlov stepped into a narrow passage that hadn't existed in any of their intelligence reports. He moved with the cautious confidence of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts by never following predictable patterns, his bodyguards flanking him as they navigated the rubble-strewn alley.
Rennick's scope was trained on the primary corridor, waiting for a target that would never appear there. Through his peripheral vision, he caught movement in grid 77 Alpha and swung his rifle toward the new position, but the angle was wrong, the range was impossible, and the target was already moving. "Contact, grid 77 Alpha," he transmitted urgently. "Target confirmed, 3-second exposure maximum." "I don't have the angle." Mason's voice was tight with frustration. "Sergeant, I can't make this shot. The buildings are blocking my line of sight." "Same here," Jonah confirmed. "Elena, if you've got eyes on target, you need to take it now." Kozlov was halfway through the passage, moving with the measured pace of a man who understood that haste invited mistakes. In 2 seconds, he would reach the safety of the fortified building beyond, and their opportunity would be gone. Rennick held his breath, finger on his trigger, knowing the shot was beyond his capabilities from his current position. The angle was wrong, the wind was gusting, and the thermal distortion would make precision impossible. But somewhere in that collapsed building, Elena Ward was tracking the target through a scope none of them understood, using calculations none of them could verify. Kozlov took another step, 1 second remaining. The shot, when it came, was completely silent. Not suppressed, silent. No muzzle crack, no sonic boom from a supersonic bullet, no metallic click of an action cycling. Just the soft whisper of displaced air, like a sigh in the darkness. Kozlov dropped instantly, his body folding as if strings had been cut. The 2 bodyguards spun in confusion, searching for a shooter they would never find, their weapons trained on empty air. "Target down." Elena's voice came through their headsets with the same calm efficiency she might use to report the weather. "Clean kill, no complications." The radio exploded with confused transmissions as the team tried to process what they had witnessed. "Elena, how? What the hell was that? Did anyone else hear that shot?" "All stations, radio silence," Rennick ordered, but his own voice carried the shock of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally challenged. Through his scope, he could see Kozlov's motionless form in the narrow passage, bodyguards still searching frantically for a threat they couldn't identify. There had been no muzzle flash, no visible trajectory, no acoustic signature that would allow enemy forces to triangulate a firing position. For all practical purposes, the target had simply died of natural causes in the middle of a heavily guarded movement. "Elena," Rennick whispered into his throat mic, "what kind of ammunition were you using?" "Custom subsonic loads, specialized ballistic design for silent elimination." "Subsonic rounds don't have the energy for a clean kill at that range. Physics doesn't work that way," Mason protested, his voice carrying disbelief. "Standard physics doesn't work that way," Elena corrected gently, "but standard physics assumes standard variables." She was already packing her equipment, preparing to leave her position while the rest of the team remained frozen in place, trying to understand what they had witnessed. "All stations, begin extraction to Rally Point Alpha," Rennick ordered, falling back on training when everything else failed to make sense. "Move carefully, maintain concealment, and avoid the target area." As they began their withdrawal through the ruined streets, Rennick found himself replaying the shot in his mind.
Elena had been right about everything: the target's route, the timing, the exposure window, even the building collapse that had created the passage. She knew details that weren't in any intelligence report, anticipated events that couldn't be predicted, and made a shot that violated everything he understood about ballistics and physics. "Sergeant," Jonah's voice was filled with quiet awe, "have you ever seen anything like that before?" Rennick considered the question as they navigated through the pre-dawn darkness. In 12 years of special operations, he had worked with some of the most elite soldiers in the world. He had seen impossible shots made under terrible conditions, witnessed feats of marksmanship that bordered on supernatural, and served alongside operators whose skills seemed to transcend normal human limitations. But he had never seen anyone simply erase a target from existence without leaving any evidence they had been there. "No, Private, I haven't," he said finally. The extraction point was a bombed-out warehouse 3 blocks from the target area, chosen for its multiple exit routes and concealed approach vectors. Rennick arrived first, as protocol demanded, and conducted a quick security sweep before establishing overwatch positions for the rest of the team. Mason arrived 10 minutes later, with his Barrett disassembled and packed, his face carrying the expression of someone whose professional confidence had been badly shaken. Jonah followed shortly after, moving with the careful precision of someone still processing extraordinary events.
Elena arrived last, carrying her rifle case with the same casual efficiency she'd displayed throughout the operation. She set it down near the wall and checked her watch, as if the mission had been nothing more than a routine training exercise. "Extraction vehicles are inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Harker's voice crackled through their headsets from the command post. "All stations confirm green status. Alpha green, Beta green, Charlie green." Elena remained silent, but her presence in the rally point confirmed her status without need for radio confirmation. Mason couldn't contain himself any longer. "Okay, I'll bite. How did you do it?" Elena looked at him with the patient expression of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "I made the shot." "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." Mason's voice carried frustration mixed with grudging respect. "Nobody makes a clean kill at that range with subsonic ammunition. The ballistics don't work, the energy transfer is insufficient, and the trajectory calculations are impossible without computer assistance." "The ballistics work if you understand all the variables," Elena replied, pulling out her weather-beaten notebook and flipping to a page covered in calculations. "Subsonic rounds eliminate the sonic crack that gives away your position. Trajectory compensation becomes a matter of reading environmental patterns rather than relying on mathematical models." She showed them a page covered in handwritten numbers: wind corrections, thermal adjustments, atmospheric pressure calculations, and factors Rennick couldn't even identify. But it wasn't the mathematics that caught his attention. It was the way the calculations seemed to flow across the page, as if Elena had been computing ballistic solutions in her head faster than most people could work with computers. "You're talking about instinctive shooting," Jonah said, his voice filled with curiosity. "Reading the environment instead of measuring it." Elena nodded approvingly. "Most snipers rely on tools to tell them what the environment is doing. They measure wind speed, calculate humidity, adjust for temperature variations, but tools can fail. Computers can malfunction, and measurements are always approximations." She closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. "I learned to feel what the environment is doing. Air pressure changes, thermal layers, wind patterns, humidity variations, they all create signatures that can be read if you know how to look." "That's impossible," Mason protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Nobody makes a clean kill at that range with subsonic ammunition. The ballistics don't work, the energy transfer is insufficient, and the trajectory calculations are impossible without computer assistance." "The ballistics work if you understand all the variables," Elena replied, pulling out her weather-beaten notebook and flipping to a page covered in calculations. "Subsonic rounds eliminate the sonic crack that gives away your position. Trajectory compensation becomes a matter of reading environmental patterns rather than relying on mathematical models." She showed them a page covered in handwritten numbers, wind corrections, thermal adjustments, atmospheric pressure calculations, and factors Rennick couldn't even identify. But it wasn't the mathematics that caught his attention. It was the way the calculations seemed to flow across the page, as if Elena had been computing ballistic solutions in her head faster than most people could work with computers. "You're talking about instinctive shooting," Jonah said, his voice filled with curiosity. "Reading the environment instead of measuring it?" Elena nodded approvingly. Most snipers rely on tools to tell them what the environment is doing. They measure wind speed, calculate humidity, adjust for temperature variations, but tools can fail. Computers can malfunction, and measurements are always approximations. She closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. "I learned to feel what the environment is doing. Air pressure changes, thermal layers, wind patterns, humidity variations, they all create signatures that can be read if you know how to look." "That's impossible," Mason protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Nobody makes a clean kill at that range with subsonic ammunition. The ballistics don't work. The energy transfer is insufficient, and the trajectory calculations are impossible without computer assistance." "The ballistics work if you understand all the variables," Elena replied, pulling out her weather-beaten notebook and flipping to a page covered in calculations. "Subsonic rounds eliminate the sonic crack that gives away your position. Trajectory compensation becomes a matter of reading environmental patterns rather than relying on mathematical models."
"The ballistics work if you understand all the variables," Elena replied, pulling out her weather-beaten notebook and flipping to a page covered in calculations. "Subsonic rounds eliminate the sonic crack that gives away your position. Trajectory compensation becomes a matter of reading environmental patterns rather than relying on mathematical models." She showed them a page covered in handwritten numbers, wind corrections, thermal adjustments, atmospheric pressure calculations, and factors Rennick couldn't even identify. But it wasn't the mathematics that caught his attention. It was the way the calculations seemed to flow across the page, as if Elena had been computing ballistic solutions in her head faster than most people could work with computers. "You're talking about instinctive shooting," Jonah said, his voice filled with curiosity. "Reading the environment instead of measuring it." Elena nodded approvingly. "Most snipers rely on tools to tell them what the environment is doing. They measure wind speed, calculate humidity, adjust for temperature variations. But tools can fail, computers can malfunction, and measurements are always approximations." She closed the notebook and returned it to her pocket. "I learned to feel what the environment is doing. Air pressure changes, thermal layers, wind patterns, humidity variations, they all create signatures that can be read if you know how to look." "That's impossible," Mason protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Human beings can't process that much environmental data in real time." "Most human beings can't," Elena agreed, "but most human beings aren't trained to operate beyond normal limitations." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Through the warehouse windows, they could see two armored Humvees moving through the debris-filled streets, their engines muffled, but their presence unmistakable. "Extraction is here," Rennick announced, shouldering his own equipment. "Time to go home." As they prepared to leave, Jonah approached Elena with the hesitant manner of someone asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Elena, would you teach me how to see the environment the way you do?" Elena studied him for a moment, and for the first time since her arrival, her expression softened slightly. "It takes years to develop that kind of environmental awareness. Most people don't have the patience for it." "I have patience," Jonah insisted. "I want to learn." "Then start by putting away your range cards and ballistic computers. Learn to read the mirage, feel the wind on your skin, understand how thermal layers bend light.
The mathematics are important, but they're just tools. True marksmanship comes from understanding the relationship between shooter, weapon, environment, and target. She picked up her rifle case and headed toward the extraction vehicles. As she reached the warehouse door, she paused and looked back at the team. The shot today wasn't about the weapon or the ammunition. It was about understanding that everything is connected. Wind, heat, pressure, light, even the target's own breathing and heartbeat. When you can read all those connections simultaneously, the impossible becomes inevitable. Then she was gone, moving toward the lead vehicle with the same controlled silence she'd maintained throughout the operation. Mason stared after her, shaking his head slowly. 12 years I've been doing this job. 12 years of thinking I understood what marksmanship meant. "What do you understand now?" Rennick asked. Mason shouldered his equipment case and followed Elena toward the vehicles. "I understand that I don't understand anything, but I want to learn." As they climbed into the extraction vehicles, Rennick found himself thinking about the notebook Elena carried, filled with calculations that went far beyond standard ballistic models. She wasn't just a sniper. She was something altogether different, operating according to principles that traditional military doctrine didn't recognize or understand. The engines roared to life, and the convoy began moving through the war-torn streets toward the safety of the base. Behind them, Sector 19 fell back into its usual pattern of violence and chaos, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Elena Ward had taken an impossible shot and made it look routine, forcing each member of the team to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their craft. The questions would multiply during debriefing, the doubts would linger for weeks, and the memory of that silent shot would haunt their dreams. But right now, as they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, all they could do was try to process the fact that they had witnessed something that would change their understanding of what was possible. Elena Ward sat in the lead vehicle, staring out at the passing ruins, her rifle case across her knees and her secrets intact. She had done what she came to do, and now she would disappear back into whatever shadowy organization had sent her, leaving behind only questions and the memory of perfection achieved through methods none of them could explain. The mission was complete. The impossible had become inevitable, and nothing would ever be the same.
The debriefing room felt smaller than usual, its gray walls seeming to close in as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference. Lieutenant Paul Harker sat across from the team at a metal table scarred by years of use, his tablet open and stylus poised to capture every detail of the operation for the official after-action report. Elena Ward occupied a chair against the far wall, positioned where she could observe everyone while remaining slightly apart from the group. Her rifle case rested at her feet, and she maintained the same composed silence that had marked her presence throughout the mission. "Let's start with the basics," Harker began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who lived by documentation and procedure. "Mission objective: elimination of target Crimson Wolf. Status: confirmed complete. Time of termination: 0832 hours. Method of elimination." He paused, stylus hovering over the tablet screen. "This is where I need specifics." Rennick shifted in his chair, still processing the events of the morning. Target was eliminated by a single precision shot from Agent Ward's position in Grid 77 Alpha. "I need technical details," Harker insisted, turning toward Elena. "Weapon system, ammunition type, range to target, environmental factors affecting the shot. The Pentagon wants hard data for their ballistic analysis department." Elena looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "Weapon system, custom precision rifle chambered in a proprietary caliber. Ammunition, subsonic hollow-point design optimized for silent elimination. Range, approximately 2,100 meters, accounting for elevation differential. Harker typed rapidly, then stopped. Subsonic ammunition doesn't have sufficient energy transfer for reliable target elimination at that range. The ballistic coefficient would result in excessive drop and insufficient terminal performance. Standard subsonic ammunition doesn't, Elena corrected, but standard ammunition is designed for standard applications. Custom loads can be optimized for specific mission parameters. Mason leaned forward, his skepticism evident despite having witnessed the shot himself. "Ma'am, with respect, you're describing ammunition that violates basic physics. Subsonic rounds lose energy rapidly over distance. Even if you could compensate for the trajectory, you wouldn't have enough kinetic energy for a clean kill." Elena pulled out her weather-beaten notebook and flipped to a page covered with ballistic calculations. Kinetic energy is only one factor in terminal performance. Bullet design, sectional density, wound channel mechanics, and target placement are equally important. A properly designed subsonic round can achieve superior results through precision rather than brute force. She showed them a sketch of what appeared to be a bullet design unlike anything in military arsenals. Elongated, with complex internal geometry that seemed to defy conventional wisdom about projectile aerodynamics. This design maintains stability at subsonic velocities while maximizing energy transfer through controlled expansion and precise shot placement. The result is silent elimination without the acoustic signature that compromises operational security. Harker stared at the sketch, his expression growing more troubled by the moment. "Where did you acquire this ammunition? Who manufactured the weapon system? What agency developed these designs?" "That information is classified above your clearance level," Elena replied, closing the notebook. Lieutenant Rennick interjected, recognizing the futility of pressing for details that Elena clearly wouldn't provide. "Maybe we should focus on operational aspects rather than technical specifications." But Harker wasn't ready to give up. "Agent Ward, I need to understand your methodology for making such precise calculations without computer assistance. You predicted the target's route change, anticipated the building collapse, and compensated for environmental factors that our most sophisticated ballistic computers couldn't process in real time." Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying each face around the table as if deciding how much truth they could handle. Most snipers treat the environment as an obstacle to overcome. They measure wind speed, calculate humidity effects, adjust for temperature variations, but the environment isn't your enemy, it's your partner. Learn to read the patterns, feel the pressure changes, understand how thermal layers affect light refraction, and you can predict conditions rather than react to them. "That's not methodology," Harker protested. "That's intuition. Intuition can't be documented, measured, or replicated." Intuition based on years of training and environmental observation. The human brain can process millions of environmental variables simultaneously if properly trained. Most people ignore this capability because they prefer the false certainty of technological solutions. Jonah spoke up from his position near the door. "You're talking about reading the battlefield like a living system rather than a collection of static measurements." Elena nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Wind patterns, thermal currents, pressure variations, humidity changes, they're all connected. The exhaust vents in Sector 19 create thermal columns that interact with ambient wind to produce predictable disturbances. The building collapse I anticipated was inevitable given the structural damage and thermal cycle changes. Everything is connected if you know how to see the connections."
The secure communications panel crackled to life, interrupting the discussion. Commander Cross's voice filled the room with quiet authority. "This is command.
Be advised that all personnel present for this debriefing are now under operational security protocols regarding Agent Ward's methods and capabilities. No information discussed in this session will be included in official reports or shared with outside agencies. Harker looked up from his tablet in confusion. "Ma'am, I need technical specifications for the after-action documentation. The Pentagon specifically requested—" "The Pentagon will receive what they need to know, Lieutenant. Nothing more." Cross's tone carried finality. "Agent Ward's operational details are compartmentalized at levels that exceed your authorization. But, Commander, are classified beyond your clearance level," Cross repeated firmly. "Your report will indicate mission success through precision marksmanship. Technical details are not your concern." Elena stood and picked up her rifle case, clearly preparing to leave. As she reached the door, Jonah called out, "Agent Ward, will we see you again?" Elena paused, her hand on the door handle. "Probably not," she said quietly. "But you'll see what you learned here. Use it well." After she left, the room fell into uncomfortable silence. Harker stared at his tablet, frustrated by the gaps in his documentation. Mason sat back in his chair, still processing the impossibility of what he'd witnessed. Rennick felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders as he realized that some missions left more questions than answers. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "what happened today stays between us. We were part of something beyond our normal operational parameters, and we're not going to understand all of it. But we learned something valuable about the limits of what's possible." "What did we learn?" Mason asked. "That the limits are a lot higher than we thought," Rennick replied. 3 weeks after the Sector 19 operation, the effects of Elena Ward's brief presence began manifesting in subtle but unmistakable ways throughout Rennick's team. What had started as curiosity about her methods gradually evolved into fundamental changes in how each man approached his craft. Jonah was the first to embrace the transformation. During training exercises, he could be found lying motionless for hours, not behind his rifle, but simply observing the environment around the range. He watched heat shimmer patterns, felt minute changes in air pressure against his skin, and began developing an almost supernatural awareness of wind patterns that other shooters couldn't detect. "Private Briggs," the range instructor called during a qualification exercise, "why aren't you using your ballistic computer?" Jonah remained prone behind his M24, eyes closed as he felt the wind shift across the training area. "Don't need it, Sergeant. The wind's going to drop in about 30 seconds, then shift 2 degrees left. That's when I'll take the shot." The instructor checked his own sophisticated weather monitoring equipment and shook his head. "Wind's been steady at 15 knots for the last 10 minutes. No change indicated." But Jonah waited, patient and still, until the flags around the range began to droop slightly. Then the wind shifted exactly as he'd predicted, and his shot took the target's center with precision that drew murmurs of approval from the other shooters. "How did you know?" the instructor demanded. "Felt it," Jonah replied, simply, unconsciously echoing Elena's approach to environmental awareness. Mason's transformation was more reluctant but equally profound. His natural competitiveness had been shaken by witnessing Elena's impossible shot, forcing him to confront the limitations of his conventional approach to marksmanship. He began experimenting with unorthodox firing positions, seeking angles and elevations that doctrine would consider suboptimal. During a mission planning exercise, he surprised everyone by selecting a low-angle position that violated standard sniper protocols. "Corporal Drake," the mission commander questioned, "that position provides inferior elevation and obstructed sight lines. Why would you choose it over the elevated hide in Building 7? Mason studied the terrain model, seeing it now through the lens of Elena's environmental awareness. "Because the thermal patterns from this industrial complex create a wind tunnel effect through Building 7. The low position puts me below the thermal disturbance and provides a cleaner shot window." The mission commander checked his meteorological data and found Mason's assessment was correct, something his sophisticated computer models had missed, but Mason had intuited through careful observation of environmental patterns. "Where did you learn to read thermal effects like that?" the commander asked. Mason's grin carried both pride and humility.
from someone who taught me that seeing is more important than measuring. Rennick found himself incorporating Elena's philosophy into his leadership and training methods. During team briefings, he began emphasizing environmental awareness over technology reliance, pushing his soldiers to develop instincts that computers couldn't replicate. Gentlemen, today we're practicing without ballistic computers, without range cards, and without wind meters. You're going to learn to read the environment the way snipers did before we had machines to think for us.
The team exchanged skeptical glances. Modern sniping depended heavily on technological aids that provided precise calculations for complex shots. "Sergeant," one of the newer shooters protested, "how are we supposed to make accurate calculations without computational assistance?" "By learning to see what the machines measure," Rennick replied. "Elena Ward taught us that technology should support your instincts, not replace them. If your equipment fails in the field, your environmental awareness is what keeps you alive." He began teaching techniques he couldn't fully explain himself: how to read mirage patterns for wind speed, how to feel barometric pressure changes, how to anticipate thermal layer effects. His soldiers were skeptical at first, but their accuracy improved as they learned to trust senses they'd never developed. Even Harker, despite his resistance to anything that couldn't be documented and measured, found himself quietly studying weather patterns and atmospheric conditions. He began correlating his meteorological data with environmental observations, searching for the connections Elena had described. Late one evening, Rennick found Harker in the weather station, surrounded by charts and atmospheric readings. "Working late, Lieutenant?" Harker looked up from his data, expression thoughtful. "I've been analyzing the environmental conditions from the Sector 19 operation, trying to understand how Agent Ward predicted that building collapse." "Any luck?" "Some," Harker admitted reluctantly. "The thermal stress patterns were there in the data, but our models weren't sophisticated enough to recognize them. She saw relationships between temperature, structural damage, and material fatigue that our computers missed." He gestured at the chart spread across his desk. "The more I study it, the more I realize that she wasn't operating on intuition alone. She was processing environmental data at a level that exceeds our technological capabilities." "So what does that mean for how we approach future operations?" Harker considered the question carefully. "It means that maybe human observation and machine calculation aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe the most effective approach combines both. Use technology to gather data, but develop human instincts to interpret patterns the machines can't recognize." The changes weren't dramatic or immediate, but they were persistent. Each member of the team found himself approaching marksmanship with a new understanding of the relationship between shooter, weapon, environment, and target. They began to see their craft not as a technological challenge to be solved, but as an art form that required harmony between human awareness and mechanical precision. Word of their improved performance began spreading through the special operations community. Other units requested training on their enhanced environmental awareness techniques, though none of them could fully explain the methods they were teaching. "How do you read wind patterns without instruments?" visiting instructors would ask. "You learn to feel the pressure on your skin, watch the grass move, observe how heat shimmer changes with air density," Jonah would explain, though he knew the words couldn't convey the full experience. "And this actually works?" The answer was in their shooting scores, their mission success rates, and the quiet confidence they carried into operations. Elena Ward had been with them for less than 24 hours, but her influence had fundamentally changed how they understood their profession. 6 months after the Sector 19 operation, Sergeant Alex Rennick found himself standing outside the communications building at Forward Operation Base Titan, listening to rumors that had traveled through the Special Operations Network like wildfire. The story was always the same: an impossible shot, no witnesses, no evidence, and a target that simply ceased to exist. "Heard it happened in the Balkans this time," Mason said, joining him in the warm evening air. "Some warlord who'd been untouchable for 3 years, found dead in his supposedly secure compound, no sign of how the shooter got in or out." Rennick nodded slowly, feeling the wind shift across the base compound. Over the past months, he learned to read environmental patterns the way Elena Ward had taught them, and tonight the air carried the distant scent of rain and the subtle pressure changes that preceded a storm system. "Same signature?" "Same signature," Mason confirmed. "Silent elimination, no muzzle flash, no acoustic evidence. Local security forces are baffled. They're calling it a heart attack, but the autopsy will probably tell a different story." Jonah approached from the direction of the training range, his rifle case slung over his shoulder and his face carrying the satisfied expression of someone who just completed a particularly challenging exercise. "You guys talking about the Belgrade incident?" he asked, setting down his equipment. "You heard about it too?" "Heard about it? Hell, I've been tracking the pattern." Jonah pulled out a small notebook, not unlike the one Elena had carried, and flipped to a page covered with dates, locations, and target descriptions. "I count at least 6 similar incidents over the past 4 months. Different countries, different targets, but the same operational signature."
Rennick studied the list, recognizing the names of several high-value targets that intelligence agencies had been tracking for years. Arms dealers, terrorist facilitators, war criminals, all of them eliminated with the same impossible precision that had characterized the Kozlov hit. "She's still out there," Mason said quietly, "still making shots that shouldn't be possible." "The question is, who's giving her the targets?" Rennick mused. "This isn't random. Someone's running a systematic elimination campaign against specific threat networks." Harker emerged from the communications building, tablet in hand, and expression troubled. "Gentlemen, I've been monitoring intelligence chatter about these incidents. Whatever agency is running Elena Ward, they're operating at a level that exceeds normal classification protocols." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there was no paperwork, no mission authorization, no operational oversight that I can detect. It's as if these eliminations are happening outside normal command structures entirely. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Elena Ward wasn't just an unconventional sniper. She was part of something that operated beyond the boundaries of traditional military or intelligence organizations." "Does it matter?" Jonah asked. "I mean, the targets she's eliminating are legitimate threats. The world's a safer place without them." "It matters, because we don't know who's making those targeting decisions," Rennick replied. "Elena Ward is a weapon of unprecedented capability. Whoever controls her has the power to eliminate anyone, anywhere, without leaving evidence or facing accountability." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Rennick tilted his face toward the sky, feeling the pressure changes he'd learned to recognize, and thought about the woman who had briefly touched their lives before disappearing back into whatever shadows had produced her. "You know what the strangest part is?" Mason said quietly. "I'm not sure I'd want to stop her, even if I could. The people she's targeting deserve what they're getting." "That's what makes her so dangerous," Rennick replied. "She's so effective, so precise, that you forget to ask who's pointing her at the targets." As they gathered their equipment and prepared to head back to the barracks, Rennick found himself wondering whether Elena Ward remembered their brief collaboration, or if their team had been just another mission in an endless series of operations that blurred together in her memory. 3,000 miles away, in a different war zone, on a different continent, Elena Ward moved through the ruins of what had once been a prosperous city. She carried the same slim rifle case, wore the same anonymous fatigues, and maintained the same controlled silence that had marked her presence at Forward Operating Base Titan. The target this time was a human trafficker who had evaded international law enforcement for a decade, a man whose network of corruption and violence stretched across 3 continents. He would be visible for approximately 4 seconds as he moved between buildings, protected by bodyguards and electronic surveillance that made conventional assassination impossible. Elena found her position in the rubble of a collapsed apartment complex, a hide that provided the perfect angle for a shot that no one else would attempt. She assembled her rifle with the same methodical precision, made her environmental calculations, and settled into the patient stillness that preceded perfect execution. Somewhere far away, Sergeant Alex Rennick was teaching young soldiers to read wind patterns and trust their instincts. Corporal Mason Drake was making impossible shots from impossible positions. Private Jonah Briggs was developing environmental awareness that seemed almost supernatural. They carried her influence with them, spreading her philosophy through the special operations community, one conversation at a time. In a profession that revered precision and honored excellence, Elena Ward had become something approaching legend, the ghost sniper who appeared without warning, eliminated impossible targets, and vanished without trace. The target stepped into view, moving with the cautious haste of a man who understood that survival required constant vigilance. Elena's finger found the trigger, her breathing stilled, and the world narrowed to the space between shooter and target. The shot, when it came, was silent. Another name crossed off another list, another threat eliminated with surgical precision. Elena began breaking down her rifle, preparing to disappear back into the vast network of shadows and secrets that had produced her. But this time, she allowed herself a moment to remember the faces of the soldiers who had witnessed her work in Sector 19. They had been skeptical at first, then amazed, then quietly determined to learn from what they'd seen. In their own way, they were carrying forward the techniques she'd shown them, adapting her methods to their own capabilities. The thought brought the faintest suggestion of a smile to her lips. Somewhere in the world, snipers were learning to see beyond their scopes, to feel the environment rather than simply measure it, to understand the true precision came from harmony between human awareness and mechanical capability. Her mission was complete, but her influence continued, spreading through the special operations community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The war continued, but the battlefield had changed, and in 1,000 different places, soldiers who had learned to see the impossible were making it inevitable, one shot at a time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.